The sky over Dresden on the evening of February 13th, 1945, was a canvas of cruel tranquility, a masterpiece of meteorological irony. A high, thin veil of cirrus cloud, illuminated by a near full moon, cast a spectral, silver light upon the Baroque spires and ornate cupolas of the Florence on the Elbe. This celestial illumination, which would have once highlighted the city's breathtaking architectural symphony for the enjoyment of its citizens and visitors, now served as a perfect navigational aid for the architects of its impending destruction. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint, familiar sounds of a city trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy amidst the slow, grinding collapse of the Third Reich. The air raid sirens had already wailed their mournful alert, a routine occurrence that the city's swollen population, now nearly double its pre-war number, with a desperate influx of over 200,000, perhaps even 300,000 refugees fleeing the relentless, brutal Soviet advance in the east, had learned to treat with a weary cynicism. This siren fatigue was a psychological phenomenon born of repeated false alarms and minor raids, a dangerous complacency that had lulled many into a fatal sense of security, convincing them that Dresden, a city known for its china, its art, and its music, was somehow exempt from the grim fate that had befallen Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin. But tonight, the sound that followed the sirens was fundamentally different. It was not the sporadic, hesitant drone of a lone reconnaissance plane or a harassing mosquito. This was a deep, resonant, and unending thunder, a mechanical earthquake in the sky that grew from a murmur to a world-consuming roar, vibrating through the window panes, rattling teacups on their saucers, and resonating into the very bones of the people huddled in their cellars and shelters. This was the sound of Operation Thunderclap, moving from theoretical planning sessions in Allied command centers to brutal, fiery reality, a plan conceived not in a simple vacuum of military necessity, but within the complex and shifting geopolitics of the final months of the European war, where military strategy was increasingly intertwined with political posturing aimed at the looming confrontation with the Soviet Union. The genesis of this night of fire lay in the highest echelons of Allied power. The concept of thunderclap had been debated since mid-1944, a plan for a single, overwhelming airstrike against a population center in eastern Germany, designed to deliver a psychological knockout blow to the German will to resist. Some proponents argued it would demonstrate to the German populace and to the watching Soviet allies the utter futility of continued resistance. The timing, however, was contentious. By February 1945, the strategic landscape had shifted beyond recognition. The German Wehrmacht was in a full, bloody retreat on both the eastern and western fronts. Its last great offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, having been decisively broken just weeks before. The Luftwaffe was a spent force, a ghost of its former self, its fuel reserves crippled by the ongoing, relentless Allied bombing campaign against synthetic oil plants, its few remaining experienced pilots overwhelmed by the sheer numerical and technical superiority of the Allied air armadas. The industrial output of the Reich was in freefall, its transportation network a tangled mess of broken rails and shattered marshalling yards. In this context, the military necessity of destroying a city like Dresden, which housed some legitimate communication and logistics targets, but was not a major industrial center like the Ruhr, or a center of arms production like Schweinfurt, was intensely debated even within the Allied High Command. The final authorization, given at the Yalta Conference just days before the raid, was as much a political signal to Stalin as it was a military order. It was a demonstration of overwhelming Western Allied air power, a stark reminder of the destructive capability that would be a defining feature of the post-war world order. The weapon, perfected over 5 years of total war, was now being deployed in a context where its original strategic justification was rapidly evaporating, turning it into an instrument of political theater with devastating, irreversible human consequences. Cruising at an altitude of 20,000 feet, far beyond the reach of the city's feeble and deliberately depleted flak defenses, which had been relocated to protect vital industrial sites in the capital, Berlin was the vanguard of RAF Bomber Command's No. 5 Group. The Avro Lancaster, the workhorse of this aerial armada, was a masterpiece of British engineering designed for a single terrible purpose. With its vast 102-foot wingspan and 4 roaring, fuel-injected Merlin engines, it was less an aircraft and more a flying bomb bay, a metallic leviathan capable of hauling an 8,000-pound cookie blast bomb. a weapon designed not with fragmentation in mind, but with pure, concussive overpressure and a subsequent payload of up to 14,000 smaller incendiaries. This mix included 4-pound magnesium sticks that burned at ferocious temperatures and phosphorus canisters that clung to surfaces and were impossible to extinguish. The doctrine guiding these men and their machines was that of Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, a man of unshakable conviction and ruthless pragmatism, a commander who had shouldered the immense moral burden of his strategy without public flinching. To Harris, the war would be won not just on the battlefields of France and Russia, but by systematically eviscerating the industrial and moral heart of Germany, a concept he euphemistically termed de-housing the German workforce. This was area bombing, a strategy born from the ashes of Coventry and the Blitz of London, refined over the Ruhr and Hamburg into a terrifyingly efficient science of destruction. The target was not a specific factory or rail yard. The target was the city itself, its infrastructure, its housing, its utilities, and, unspoken but universally understood, its people. The Pathfinder Mosquitoes of No. 627 Squadron, fast and agile wooden wonders, had already done their work. Their green and red target indicators blooming with chilling accuracy directly over the Altstadt, the historic old town, its dense medieval street pattern making it a perfect firebox. They transformed a center of European culture into a giant glowing bullseye, a signal for the impending deluge of high explosives and fire that was minutes away. Inside the Lancasters, a strange, detached professionalism took hold. The crews, a mix of seasoned veterans on their final operations and fresh-faced newcomers on their first, went through their well-rehearsed drills. The bomb aimers lay prone in their transparent noses, their voices calm over the intercom as they guided the pilots onto the final approach. Left, steady. The pilots, their hands gripping the control yokes, fought to keep the massive aircraft steady in the turbulent sky. The slipstream and prop wash from hundreds of other bombers creating a chaotic aerial highway. The navigators tracked their position, while the gunners, shivering in their exposed turrets, scanned the empty dark sky for the non-existent German night fighters. The radio silence was absolute, broken only by the constant shuddering roar of the engines, a sound that was both a comfort and a menace. The first wave, 244 Lancasters strong, began its bomb run at 10:13 p.m. The initial seconds after the bomb bays yawned open were deceptively quiet, a moment of suspended animation. Then, the world below erupted. The first to fall were the 4,000-pound high-capacity cookies. These were not precision instruments. They were sledgehammers of apocalyptic force. Their function was not merely to destroy, but to eviscerate, to disembowel the city. The colossal overpressure from their detonations acted like a giant invisible fist, smashing buildings not to rubble, but to splinters, creating a kill zone measured in city blocks. The physics were simple and brutal. The blast wave, moving faster than the speed of sound, would hit a structure, and moments later, the vacuum behind it would pull it all back out again. Windows exploded into clouds of razor-sharp glass scything through rooms. Roofs were torn from buildings as if by the hand of a giant. Centuries-old timber frames were exposed like the ribs of a skeleton, instantly turned to tinder. This was the crucial first phase of the Bomber Command doctrine: to open the city up, to strip it bare, to create a landscape of perfect kindling for the second act of the tragedy. Then seconds later came the rain of fire. Over 650,000 small incendiaries tumbled into the shattered ruins. They fell through gaping holes in roofs, into attics filled with stored furniture and books, onto streets clogged with debris, igniting everything they touched. What began as hundreds, then thousands, of individual fires quickly began to merge, feeding on the oxygen-rich air being sucked into the growing inferno. The firefighters on the ground, brave and determined men of the Dresden Feuerwehr and volunteer units, found their efforts were not just futile, they were suicidal. The carefully laid plans for municipal fire defense disintegrated in minutes. Water mains had been shattered by the initial blasts, and the few hydrants that still functioned spewed a pathetic trickle. The very streets they tried to navigate became rivers of flame, their hoses melting, their leather uniforms cracking in the intense heat, their fire engines themselves becoming funeral pyres. Communication lines were severed, and command structures collapsed into isolated pockets of desperate, hopeless resistance against an elemental force. The city was being systematically and scientifically burned to the ground. As the last of the first wave Lancasters turned for home, their crews glancing back at the glowing orange cauldron they had created. A sight that many would later describe in their diaries as both awe-inspiring and soul-chilling. A vision of hell itself. The city of Dresden was already in its death throes. But the architects of Thunderclap, in their cold calculus, had engineered a second, more psychologically devastating act. A masterstroke of calculated terror, designed explicitly to maximize casualties and shatter any remaining semblance of order. For 3 agonizing hours, the people of Dresden endured the unimaginable. Those in deep, modern public shelters, like the massive one under the main train station, survived, though the air grew hot and foul, and the very walls trembled, as if in the grip of a perpetual earthquake, the sound of the world ending echoing from above. Those in smaller private cellars, or caught in the open, were incinerated, suffocated, or crushed by collapsing buildings. Families huddled together were buried alive or vaporized by direct hits. The streets became charnel houses, just as the most resilient survivors began to tentatively emerge, believing the worst was over, their lungs gasping for clean air, their eyes straining to see through the smoke and dust. And just as the emergency services from neighboring districts began to muster for a rescue effort, the second wave arrived. This was not a mistake, not a double booking of targets. It was a deliberate, tactical decision, explicitly designed to catch rescue workers and survivors in the open, thereby compounding the catastrophe and ensuring the complete breakdown of civil response. At 1:21 a.m. on February 14th, another force of over 500 Lancasters from No. 1 and No. 3 groups appeared over the city. Their bombs, aimed with cold precision at the outskirts and the now critical transportation corridors, fell upon a landscape already transformed into a biblical vision of hell. They targeted the rescue trains pulling into the sidings, the fire engines arriving from places like Meissen and Pirna, the columns of dazed refugees trudging through the Grosser Park, and the very squares where survivors had gathered, thinking themselves safe. The chaos was now absolute, the devastation complete. The firestorm, which had been a growing, terrifying conflagration, now achieved its full, apocalyptic potential. The term firestorm is a scientific one, describing a meteorological event created by man. It requires a perfect, terrible synergy of factors, a high density of combustible buildings. Dresden's medieval core was ideal, a concentrated initial ignition, provided by the 2 massive, sequential raids, and specific atmospheric conditions, the cold, still night air. The result was a self-sustaining atmospheric furnace, a phenomenon previously witnessed on a smaller scale in Hamburg and later to be seen in Tokyo. The science is terrifying in its simplicity. The heat at the core rose so violently, temperatures later estimated by scientists to exceed 500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt glass, steel, and bronze, that it created a colossal thermal updraft. This in turn acted like a giant chimney, sucking cooler air from the periphery at speeds exceeding hurricane force, 100 miles per hour or more. These winds did not blow out the fires. They fed them, fanning the flames into a white-hot frenzy, turning streets into blast furnaces and creating a vortex of flame that consumed every molecule of available oxygen. People in shelters who had survived the blasts were not burned. They were baked alive in a communal oven or died silently of carbon monoxide poisoning as the firestorm sucked the very breath from their lungs. Those who fled into the streets seeking air were caught in a literal river of fire, the superheated air searing their lungs with a single gasp, the melting asphalt swallowing their feet, their clothing bursting into flames spontaneously. The firestorm became a living entity, a dragon that fed upon itself, creating its own weather system of fire and wind, generating tornadoes of flame and a terrifying, continuous roar that drowned out all other sound, a sound described by survivors as being like a monstrous beast, a waterfall, or the express train of hell devouring the world. The Grosser Garten, a vast park where thousands had sought refuge, was incinerated. The trees and the people under them turned to carbonized statues in a matter of minutes. Dawn on February 14th did not bring light, but a deeper, more profound darkness, a pillar of black smoke, churning with ash and soot and the particulate remains of a city. Its culture and its people ascended over 15,000 feet into the sky, visible for 100 miles in every direction, a grim, towering signal of the annihilation below. It was this pillar, this monstrous funeral pyre, that served as the final, unambiguous beacon for the third wave. At midday, 316 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses of the United States 8th Air Force's 1st Bombardment Division appeared in the stark, cold winter sky. Their official mission, as briefed, was a precision daylight raid on the marshalling yards and transportation hubs on the city's periphery, targets of alleged military significance intended to prevent the reinforcement of the collapsing Eastern Front and to complete the Thunderclap plan. But for the veteran American crews, men who had braved the murderous flak and relentless Focke-Wulf fighter attacks over Berlin and Schweinfurt, the sight that greeted them was something entirely new and profoundly unsettling. Through their plexiglass noses, they saw a city that was simply gone. Where once a skyline of breathtaking beauty, a testament to centuries of human artistic endeavor, had stood, there was now a flat, smoldering plain of grey and black, a lunar landscape punctuated only by the eerie, glowing red of persistent underground fires burning in the cellars and basements below. The scale of the destruction was so total it defied comprehension. The stench, a sickening cocktail of burned wood, brick, plastic, and something unidentifiably organic. The smell of a city's death, the smell of cremated human flesh, permeated their pressurized cabins, a ghost that would haunt their nightmares and memories for decades to come. They dropped their bombs on the assigned coordinates, but for many it felt like a hollow, grotesque act, like dropping rocks on a freshly dug grave, a futile and macabre gesture that added little to the military victory, but much to their own simmering moral burden. The aftermath on the ground was a descent into a new kind of hell, one of silence, ash, and unimaginable horror. As the temperatures slowly cooled over the following days, the true scale of the carnage became apparent. Rescue workers, soldiers, and forced laborers began the ghastly task of recovering the dead. They found scenes that stripped away the last vestiges of humanity from the war. Bodies were piled in the streets, shrunk by the intense heat to the size of small children. Their features melted away, their poses frozen in a final, agonized contortion. In the cellars, people were found sitting in groups, seemingly untouched by fire, but dead from suffocation. Their skin turned a waxy pink color from carbon monoxide poisoning. The Altstadt was a vast, smoldering tomb. The Zwinger Palace, a jewel of Baroque architecture, was a shattered shell. The Semper Opera House was a gutted ruin. The Frauenkirche, the great Lutheran church that had dominated the skyline, had withstood the initial firestorm. But the intense heat had weakened its sandstone structure, and on the afternoon of February 15th, it collapsed in upon itself in a great cloud of dust, leaving only two skeletal fragments of its outer walls standing. The city centre was declared a totem zone, a zone of death. The logistical challenge of disposing of so many corpses was immense. Mass cremations were organised in the Altmarkt Square, using flamethrowers and pyres of wood and rubble, a grim final echo of the fires that had killed them. Thousands more were buried in mass graves on the heathlands outside the city, their identities lost to the flames. In the days and weeks that followed, as the world slowly learned the details of what had transpired through fragmented news reports and the accounts of neutral observers, a profound and uncomfortable reckoning began to take hold within the Allied alliance. The Soviet High Command, to whom the destruction of German rear areas and communication nodes was a direct military blessing that would ease their final, vengeful push to Berlin, voiced no public objection. But in London and Washington, a deep moral unease festered among politicians, clergy, and intellectuals. Winston Churchill, who had been a staunch supporter of Harris's area bombing campaign, famously distanced himself in a later memo, questioning the use of mere acts of terror and wanton destruction. Reports from neutral observers, like the Swiss journalist Max Schursch, described a city of the dead, a cultural landmark erased with terrifying efficiency. The initial German propaganda claims, broadcast by Joseph Goebbels with cynical brilliance, of over 200,000, even 500,000 dead, were wildly inflated for political effect, designed to sway neutral opinion, galvanize a weary populace for a final, futile stand, and tar the Allies with the brush of barbarism. But even the sober, modern historical estimates of 25,000 fatalities, with some recent studies painstakingly examining burial records and suggesting the number could be as high as 35,000, represented a catastrophic, concentrated loss of civilian life in a single 48-hour period, the vast majority of whom were women, children, and the elderly refugees who had thought they had found sanctuary. The question, debated in newspaper editorials, in churches, and in the halls of power, was no longer simply, could we do it, but should we have at that time and in that way. The narrative of the good war, a clear-cut fight against absolute evil, was suddenly clouded with the ashy residue of a horror that seemed to mirror the very brutality the Allies were fighting to extinguish, raising agonizing questions about the nature of victory and the methods used to achieve it. The man at the epicenter of this moral storm was Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Bomber Harris. To Harris and his supporters, both during and after the war, Dresden was not an aberration. It was the logical, if ultimate, expression of a doctrine born from necessity and hardened in the crucible of existential conflict. In the dark days of 1941 and 1942, when Britain stood alone against the Nazi behemoth and the German war machine seemed unstoppable, strategic bombing was the only weapon available to strike directly at the heart of Germany, to demonstrate to a besieged and battered nation that the fight was being taken to the enemy, that they were not alone. The technology for precision bombing at night, or through the pervasive European cloud cover, simply did not exist. The famed Norden bombsight was useless without visual reference. The only way to ensure any meaningful damage to the enemy's war-making capacity was to saturate an entire industrial area with bombs, accepting the inevitable, widespread collateral damage as the grim, non-negotiable cost of war and survival. The destruction of cities like Cologne, Essen, and Hamburg was, in this brutal calculus, the price of preventing a Nazi victory. The firestorm created over Hamburg in Operation Gomorrah in 1943 had killed over 40,000 people, a terrifying precedent that had already normalized the concept of city leveling and made a raid like Dresden conceivable, a grim but accepted escalation in a war of escalating horrors. Harris never apologized, never expressed public regret, believing to his dying day that his campaign had shortened the war and saved the lives of Allied soldiers who would have otherwise died in a ground invasion of a fortified Germany. For the American airmen of the 8th Air Force, the mission over Dresden and the subsequent publicity provoked a quiet, persistent crisis of conscience that would linger long after the war's end, often unspoken but deeply felt. They were the products of a different doctrinal tradition, championed by men like General Ira C. Eaker, and later, with even greater ferocity in the Pacific, by Curtis LeMay. The philosophy of the USAAF was, in theory, daylight precision bombing, the very design of the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, with their multiple heavy machine guns for self-defense in tight formation boxes and their sophisticated, secret Norden bombsight, was predicated on the belief that it was possible and morally preferable to destroy key military and industrial nodes, ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries, without resorting to the wholesale slaughter of civilians that characterized the RAF's area bombing. Yet, the reality of the air war over Europe had brutally exposed the limits of this high-minded theory. Persistent cloud cover over the continent, the lethal black chaos of German flak, and the swift, deadly attacks of enemy fighters made pickle-barrel bombing a rare exception. A myth perpetuated by stateside propaganda reels. The precision often meant that the majority of bombs fell within a mile of the aim point, an area that invariably included residential neighborhoods, schools, and hospitals. They had participated in area raids before, notably on Berlin and in the pre-invasion softening of the French coast. But the sheer scale and visible, concentrated totality of Dresden's destruction, the sheer aesthetic of annihilation, struck a different, deeper chord. They had become, in that moment, the instruments of a form of warfare that erased the distinction between soldier and civilian, between a military target and a city's entire being, forcing them to confront an uncomfortable, enduring truth. In the cockpit of a bomber, 5 miles high, detached from the screams and the terror below, insulated by altitude, technology, and mission focus, the view of morality becomes dangerously abstract, and the cold calculus of war can utterly eclipse its human conscience. The legacy of the fire from above did not cool with the embers of Dresden. It seared itself into the conscience of the 20th century and fundamentally shaped the laws of armed conflict in the 21st. The raid became a permanent, contentious reference point in all subsequent debates over military ethics and the morality of air power. It is a staple of arguments about strategic bombing that resurfaced with every major conflict involving air forces. During the Vietnam War, with the bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong, the secret bombing of Cambodia, the controversial targeting in Kosovo, the shock and awe campaign in Iraq, and the protracted air wars in Afghanistan and against the Islamic State. The images of the smouldering city were powerfully and cynically co-opted by Nazi propaganda in the war's final months and, later, by far-right apologists and historical revisionists seeking to create a false moral equivalence between the Holocaust and the bombing, a distortion that complicated honest, nuanced historical assessment for decades and poisoned the well of public memory. But more importantly, the ghost of Dresden haunted the halls where post-war international law was written. The principles of distinction between military objectives and civilians, and proportionality, that the collateral damage must not be excessive in relation to the direct military advantage anticipated, which were codified in the 1949 Geneva Conventions and their 1977 additional protocols, are the direct legal and moral descendants of the lessons learned, however painfully and belatedly, from the ashes on the banks of the Elbe. It was a watershed moment that forced the victors, in their moment of triumph, to scrutinize their own methods and acknowledge implicitly that the pursuit of a just cause could be profoundly compromised and its moral authority irrevocably tarnished by the use of unjust or indiscriminate means. Dresden stands as a permanent warning about the seductive danger of allowing a military capability, once perfected, to dictate strategy beyond the point of necessity. The city of Dresden today, with its magnificently reconstructed Frauenkirche, a project that stood for decades as a ruinous memorial, a deliberate pile of blackened stones left by the East German government as an anti-fascist, anti-war statement, before being rebuilt after reunification using original plans and even salvaged stones, now standing as a global symbol of reconciliation and hope, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of memory to inspire healing and renewal. The restored Zwinger Palace and Semper Opera House similarly speak to a city that has refused to let its past be entirely erased. But the memory of those 2 nights and 1 day in February 1945 endures not just in rebuilt stones, but as a permanent, sobering lesson in the physics of destruction and the philosophy of war. It represents the apotheosis of conventional strategic bombing in the European theatre, the point at which air power ceased to be merely a tactical tool for supporting armies and fully manifested its potential as a standalone weapon of mass destruction, a direct precursor to the atomic horrors that would descend upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki just 6 months later. For the United States, in the very zenith of its triumphal ascent as a global superpower whose industrial and military might had proven decisive in the defeat of fascism, the firestorm over Dresden forced a quiet, internal confrontation with the terrifying ambiguity of that power. The bombs that fell secured a victory that was by then inevitable, but in the haunting, silent glare of the flames reflected on the plexiglass of their cockpits, America was compelled to stare into the abyss of total war and recognize that the same technology that promised liberation from tyranny could also deliver a localized apocalypse, that the machinery of democracy, when wielded with absolute impersonal force, could produce outcomes of terrifying, inhuman totality. The victory over Nazism was, and remains, one of history's most necessary triumphs, a crusade against an evil of unprecedented scale and malevolence, but its price, etched in the scorched stones of Dresden and the haunted memories of its survivors and its perpetrators, would forever include a fragment of its victor's moral certainty, a sacrifice on the altar of necessity that continues to demand reflection, remembrance, and a solemn, enduring vow to never let the exigencies of war, however just the cause, completely extinguish the light of our shared humanity. The story of Dresden is not one of simple heroes and villains, but a complex, tragic, and deeply ambiguous chapter in a necessary war. A stark reminder that even in the fight against absolute darkness, we must remain vigilant guardians of our own humanity, lest we become mirrors of the very brutality we seek to destroy. It is a warning from history that echoes through the decades, as relevant today in an era of drone warfare and satellite-guided munitions, as it was in the age of the Lancaster and the Flying Fortress.